The Misadventures of an Escape Artist, episode 10. Losing control on takeoff. I am now a captain, a flight commander on a Piper Navajo, as well as on a Cessna 404. I was soon to learn a valuable lesson that would serve me throughout my life as a pilot. I took off from Alma Airport in difficult weather conditions in a pelting rainstorm. There was a low ceiling with a cloud layer of only 200 feet above the ground. The plane didn't have a working autopilot, so after takeoff I needed to keep my eye on the artificial horizon to ensure that the plane was flying at a 15-degree pitch angle. As the plane ascended quickly into the clouds, I had to keep checking to see that the 15-degree pitch was being maintained. I foolishly decided to glance at the instrument panel on the right side to see that everything was okay. This was a colossal mistake. Looking back at the artificial horizon, I saw that the plane was hurtling towards the ground. Panicking, I pulled the controls towards myself for a fast descent back to a proper altitude. I missed crashing the plane into the ground by a mere few feet. This was the first and last time I lost control of an aircraft. Control is first and foremost. Then, and only then, can you assess a problem and take the necessary steps to address the situation. Engine temperature in the red. 6 months after that near-fatal mistake, I was flying solo towards Couillot-Rapik village next to Nunavut in Hudson's Bay in northern Quebec. I was transporting cases of machinery parts to accompany an urgent need of this equipment. There were no passengers on board, so no need for a co-pilot. In those days, many small airline companies did not respect the rules concerning maximum weight and temperature limits for their aircraft. The Navajo had a lower temperature limit of minus 35 degrees Fahrenheit. Yet some small airlines in Quebec demanded that their pilots fly at even lower temperatures. Today, these regulations are followed to the letter by most countries. I'd been in the air for about 2 hours when I noticed that the temperature of the engines were in the red zone. In other words, I was headed for a complete engine meltdown. I realized that if I were to crash in this wilderness, there'd be a good chance I would not be found alive. The outside temperature was minus 55, and the engines were not supposed to be used under minus 35. I was far from any airport, and my home base was hours away. The radio frequencies from Transport Canada were out of range. There was a high-frequency radio on the plane, the same system used by pilots and the Navy to contact traffic control centers across the Atlantic and Pacific, when they are more than an hour or two from the nearest land. I contacted the chief mechanic, who informed me that the oil from the engines had frozen, and that I needed to reduce my engine power and my flying speed to a few knots above the stall speed. The mechanic told me to use full flaps with lowered landing gear, which would reduce the airspeed and increase the pitch angle. This step would alleviate the frigid minus 55 degree air hitting the oil pan and freezing the oil. Without this oil, the unlubricated engine pistons rub directly against the metal cylinders, overheating them until they melt down. Now, with the lowered airspeed, the heat from the engine could defrost the oil. In less than 5 minutes, the engine temperature dropped to normal, and I continued my flight without incident. Saving a life in Perron. It was night time, and I received a call to fly to a tiny village in the northern part of the province of Quebec. The town of Perron had a population of 200, with no hospital or airport. I would be picking up a seriously ill child and transporting him to the nearest hospital in La Tuque, which was a 6-hour drive from Perron. Air transport was basically the only solution for a chance of survival for this remotely located medical emergency. Because of the situation of the village and its location, a navigational aid was only a pilot's wet dream. The region was surrounded by vast expanses of forest and lakes. The makeshift runway was a 1-kilometer road with 2 flaming barrels of oil at both ends. It was a gorgeous starry night, and the flight was smooth. Unfortunately, no co-pilots were available, and I did not want to fly there solo. So Jacques Simard, the president of the airline, agreed to accompany me on this journey. He was a flight mechanic, not a pilot, but he was my security blanket on this dangerous journey. The child was about 6 or 7, and we quickly tucked him, his mother, and the nurse safely on board the Navajo. We took off for La Tuque Airport, where an ambulance was waiting to take the sick child to the hospital. The next day we returned to Paron with the real co-pilot, the now recuperating child, his mother and the nurse. On final approach, I noticed a rather high hill. It hadn't been there the night before while landing in the darkness. Or had it? We must have missed it by only a few feet. Luck, that ultimate trickster, has a way of toying with our lives. Who the hell forgot to close the luggage door? During the winter, while on our regular evening flight schedule between Alma, Roberval and Montreal, a frightening incident occurred. We left Alma for Roberval to pick up additional passengers for the final leg to Montreal. The co-pilot left his seat to welcome the additional passengers. Sitting behind me on the first passenger seat was the head of the flight school where I had trained as a pilot 8 years before. My co-pilot put the passengers' luggage in the hold, which was in the nose of the aircraft. The baggage compartment opened upwards like a trunk. He placed the luggage in the hold and closed the compartment door, but forgot to fasten the latch. The co-pilot returned to his seat. I started both engines and positioned us for takeoff. Acceleration was perfect, but at the moment of liftoff, the baggage compartment door swung open. It was at a 90-degree angle to the wind, so it wasn't immediately torn off its hinges. I realized that if the door came off, it could easily fly into the engine or plane's rear stabilizer and send us crashing to the ground. I immediately reduced the thrust of the engines to lower the speed without stalling the plane. I climbed to a safe altitude of 2,500 feet. It was clear that we needed to return to Roberval to land. Despite the low visibility and bad weather, I made a slow 180-degree turn to try another full instrument approach at slow speed, hoping not to lose the baggage door on our return to the runway. We had to fly 10 miles away from the airport and return on a long final, following the instrument approached in the snow. I finally saw the runway. We landed and went back to the parking zone, killed the engines, and I finally caught my breath. Checking on the baggage compartment, we saw that the plane had not been damaged in any way, so we were able to resume our flight now that the baggage door was secure and locked. While I taxied our plane back to the runway, my flight school instructor, Mr. Matthew, leaned forward behind me and congratulated me on a job well done. I could not stop grinning. Rain, rain, go away. In February 1989, I began my training as a co-pilot on the Embraer 110. This twin-engine aircraft is powered by two PT-6 turbines. The plane is not pressurized, so it is flown between 6,000 and 10,000 foot altitude. The airline has never ordered the optional weather radar, and so avoiding a thunderstorm was hit and miss, as pilots need an in-depth knowledge of cloud formation. Eventually I made my first passenger flight with the Embraer 110. We were cruising at an altitude of 7,000 feet, in and out of heavy rain. Suddenly we entered an extremely violent storm cloud and were sucked up into it. The captain began to push down on the controls in order to stop the plane from climbing. At the same time, he shouted at me to reduce the throttle as we were exceeding the maximum speed. As I had already reduced the engine power, the captain did not seem to understand the situation. The plane was climbing at an alarming speed. Suddenly we were out of the storm clouds and into bright blue sunny sky. We were not in Kansas anymore. Before getting caught in the storm, our altitude was 7,000 feet, heading southwest. After emerging through the thundercloud, we were at an altitude of 17,000 feet, heading northeast. At 17,000 feet, there is less air and it's hard to breathe, so we descended rapidly to our initial altitude. Thankfully, all the passengers happened to be in their seats with their seat belts fastened.